Life Under the Sun, which we entitled All is Vanity, which I'll explain in a minute while we use that word. Last week, if you were here, we were thinking about the resurrection. And I wonder over Easter whether the full impact of the resurrection hit you, whether you understood all that it actually means for us as people to live in the period of history after the resurrection, when we enter into the experience of the resurrection. I want to head back to that for a minute because I want us to understand what we're going to see in Ecclesiastes in the light of the resurrection. In actual fact, Ian Randall mentioned this briefly last week, and looking forward to today. I don't know whether you picked up that hint, but I wanted to pick up from what Ian said last week and to remind us all what it says in the most important parts of the New Testament that speaks about the resurrection, which is 1 Corinthians 15. Paul is speaking to a church where some people are beginning to doubt the resurrection and say, well, maybe it's already happened. Maybe it's just a sort of thing you imagine in your mind rather than anything real. And he says this: if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. The word useless in some translations is in vain, from which we get, of course, the word vanity. More of that again in a minute. He carries on at the end of that chapter. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm, let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labour in the Lord is not in vain. It is not in vain. In fact, both those times when it uses that word in vain and useless, it's the same Greek word, and the Greek word means empty. Okay? Our preaching is empty, and so is your faith. It's void, nothing there. You know how, he says, having finished that chapter and explained the resurrection, now he says, now you know that your labour in the Lord is not empty. It is not in vain. Emptiness, vanity, meaninglessness, this is the awful alternative to the resurrection. Last week we heard about the resurrection, but here and now we're going to hear from Ecclesiastes about the alternative to that, which is vanity. And by vanity, I'm not talking about people preening themselves in a mirror and putting on all sorts of clothes or whatever it may be to make themselves look good. I'm talking about the word vanity that comes from the word vain, meaning in vain, meaning empty, futile, meaningless. The word we have here in verse 2, Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 2, meaningless. Meaningless, says the teacher. We have come from last week, the resurrection, back down to earth with a big bump this morning into Ecclesiastes. A shock to the system, a cold water shower. This is what life is really like for people on this earth under the sun. For Christians, we live in two worlds. Do you know that? We live in two worlds. We have, on the one hand, if the resurrection has become real to us, if we have been saved, we have been seated with Christ in the heavenly realms, above the sun, if you like. But actually, we also still live under the sun, don't we? Live out our mortal lives here, up to the grave, under the sun. And we need to work out what this means for us, how to live in these two worlds, how we approach life, what we invest in our years on this earth. Under the sun life is actually the only reality for others who are not yet believers. And one of our principal roles as believers is to connect with such people in this life, in our shared experience of life under the sun, and to be able to point them to a different life, the resurrection life, people who have been seated with Christ in the heavenly realms, where our future is, where there's a place waiting for us. I think someone mentioned this, didn't they, over Easter. I think it was Gary, actually, on Easter Sunday evening, that you know there is a place reserved for you in heaven. That is where your home is. But for the time being, we are sojourners on this earth, in this life. And our responsibility is to connect with other people and to show them something different than the everyday existence they have come to know. So let's look at this passage then and see what we have to learn from it. First of all, we need to understand who this person is who is bringing this teaching to us. He is called the teacher, the words of the teacher. Elsewhere, in other versions, he's called the preacher. If you look at the footnotes in the NIV, it says this word means leader of the assembly. It may be helpful to go back to your school days here, perhaps when you were sitting in an assembly at school and a man marched in his all his finery with his maybe mortarboard and his gown, and at the front, and there was your head teacher or headmaster, and you trembled a little bit because you knew that this was the top man of the place, and then he spoke in sonorous tones to you about whatever it was that was important. Maybe he gave a lesson from the Bible, as they used to do in schools. Well, that was the head teacher of a school, wasn't it, in those days? And he was the leader of the assembly. He was the one at the front, speaking to the assembly. And you always thought of assembly, it was that sort of time in the morning, 5 to 9, whatever, you used to congregate in that building and then listen to the top man speak. Well, that's who this teacher is. He is the leader of an assembly. But it says also that he is the son of David and the king of Jerusalem. So he's a particular person in authority as well, who is related to David, the king of Jerusalem. Go down to verse 12, and it says there that I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. That narrows it down, because actually the kings after Rehoboam were kings in Jerusalem over Judah. Remember the kingdom split into two? The northern kingdom of Israel, capital of Samaria, and the southern kingdom of Judah. So I would guess from this teacher is king over the whole of Israel before the kingdoms split. That narrows it down, of course, a great deal more as to who it actually is. It mentions also in verse 16 that he was a ruler. He ruled over Jerusalem, and he had more wisdom. He grew in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. Although the name Solomon doesn't appear anywhere in Ecclesiastes, it does seem it's difficult for it to be anyone else except Solomon, whose writings are recorded here. There is a complete match-up, it seems to me, between what we know of Solomon's experience of life and the person who is speaking to us here. Just have a look at verse 16, first of all, chapter 1. I thought to myself, look, I have grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone else who has lived or ruled over Jerusalem before me. I've experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. So he's someone who actually is known for his wisdom, which of course we know was true of Solomon. Look at chapter 2 and verse 4. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself, planted vineyards, I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees, made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees, bought male and female slaves and other slaves. I owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired men and women singers and a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. And if we read about Solomon's life, I think we will see that this really points very much to him. In fact, I'm going to ask you to turn back in your Bibles to 1 Kings 3, briefly. Page 338 in the church Bibles, if you're using those, page 338. I think it's important to go through this, so please bear with me a little bit if you think I'm taking a bit of time about this. I don't want to take any more time than we have to. But I think for us to understand this match-up between Solomon and the person addressing us in Ecclesiastes is important. So in 1 Kings chapter 3, page 338 of the church Bibles, verse 5 of chapter 3, God, the Lord, appears to Solomon during the night in a dream, and he says to him, "Ask me whatever you want me to give you." And in verse 9, Solomon says, "So please give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" And indeed, the Lord was very pleased with that request that he asked for, wisdom. So verse 12, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be." And also he said, "I'll give you riches and honour as well." Throw it in with the deal. So we see that Solomon is a very wise person, given wisdom from on high. Turn over to chapter 4 and verse 21. Chapter 4 and verse 21. Solomon rules over all the kingdoms from the river, that's the Euphrates, to the land of the Philistines, that's bordering Mediterranean, as far as the border of Egypt. These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all his life. He ruled over a great empire that today would cover Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. A lot of the Middle East. It's a huge area where he ruled. His kingdom, his empire, stretched an awful long way, greater in power than any king of Israel before or since. Go to verse 29. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the men of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than any other man, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Dana, the sons of Mahol. And his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He described plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also taught about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. Men of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of this wisdom. A real polymath, isn't he? Chapters 5 and 6 speak about him building the temple, one of the great buildings of the ancient world. And then if you go on to chapter 7, there he built his own palace. 13 years he took to complete the construction of this great palace, the palace of the forest of Lebanon, and it describes it there. In chapter 8 and verse 1, Solomon summons an assembly. Here's your headmaster, king over Israel. Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes, and the chiefs of the Ishmaelite families, to bring up the ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David. So all Israel, all the heads of Israel, were assembled before him. He stood there like a headmaster. Look at verse 22 of chapter 8 again. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel, and spread his hands towards heaven and prayed. So there we see the guy who is the teacher, the head of Israel, leading them in their praise of God. Chapter 9, verse 26, just turn over to that for a moment. King Solomon had a trading empire. He built ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elath in Edom, on the shore of the Red Sea. So his empire went down to look out on the Indian Ocean from the Red Sea. And Hiram, his ally, the king of Lebanon, sent his men, sailors who knew the sea, to serve in the fleet with Solomon. They sailed to Ophir and brought back 420 talents of gold, which they delivered to King Solomon. In chapter 10 and verse 5, the Queen of Sheba comes, of course, to see this magnificent sight. And it says there at the end of verse 4 that she saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food on the table, the seating of his officials, his cupbearers, burnt offerings. She was overwhelmed. The actual words, it took the breath out of her. She was gobsmacked by what she saw here at Solomon. Verse 14 of chapter 10. The weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents, not including the revenues from merchants and traders and from all the Arabian kings and the governors of the lands. So So he accumulated great wealth. You read on about it there, about goblets of gold and all the rest of his acquisitions. Chapter 10 and verse 22. Every 3 years the fleet returned, carrying gold, silver and ivory, apes and baboons. All this animal life that Solomon took great delight in, as we read earlier. Chapter 11, verses 1 and 3. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women, besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. So he had a huge harem, didn't he, as we read earlier in Ecclesiastes. But as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David, his father, had been. Let's turn back then to Ecclesiastes. That little picture of Solomon, I hope, gives a picture of the man who I believe is the author of this book, or the one whose writing has sort of come to be recorded in this book. A man of incredible ability, of incredible wealth, power, but who has lost his way spiritually, who has lapsed into idolatry. And throughout the book, if you read the book of Ecclesiastes, there is a sense of sadness about it, a sense of mournfulness, of pain. It's written by a chastened man, a man who has so much, yet finds it all, like those bubbles. So beautiful, but so fleeting. It's all gone. It's also pointless, so meaningless. Life has become full of frustration for him. Why have I spent all this time talking about Solomon and looking back at 1 Kings for something about his life? Well, I believe it's because Solomon, it seems to me, is uniquely qualified to speak about life under the sun. No one has had as much experience of life under the sun as he has been so blessed. Here is a picture of a man on Table Mountain. He's looking from Table Mountain down over Cape Town, isn't he? What a vantage point to have. To see all that big city laid out beneath you. And then, of course, the Indian Ocean. And maybe if you, well, you can see it, I've never been there, but you've got the Atlantic Ocean, haven't you? Just a few miles one way. Indian Ocean just the other way. What an incredible sight that must be. That's a bit like Solomon, isn't it? He's been put on the highest peak, it seems, with all the power that's been given to him. And he's looking down and he can see life under the sun. He's experienced it himself. No one else has been so privileged in history as Solomon was by God. Have a look at verse 14 of chapter 1 here of Ecclesiastes. I have seen all the things, he says, like this guy here. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, are chasing after the wind. That's what he can see from his vantage point. And yet today, so many people spend so much time striving for these very things, don't they? Chasing after the wind. Perhaps you do as well. Sometimes. None of us will be like Solomon, have as much power, authority, wealth, opportunity as he had. Let's learn from him what it means to have everything and yet realise actually it means nothing unless we have something extra that God can give us. Is there something beyond this, something over the sun, above the sun that we have not yet experienced? Solomon himself, for all his magnificence, did not experience. Meaningless, he says. Meaningless. Everything is meaningless. It's a key word in this book of Ecclesiastes. It will repeat itself dozens of times over these following 12 chapters. In other versions, the Authorized Version, for instance, or the English Standard Version, the word is vanity. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. And that, of course, is the title we've given to this morning. All is vanity. It's a lovely phrase, isn't it? It comes off the tongue very easily. It's something we remember quite well. In actual fact, the word here, the Hebrew word, is the word breath or vapour. It's the sort of thing which, when we blew those bubbles, we were putting breath into those bubbles, weren't we? And they became bubbles, but then they burst. And the breath, you couldn't see it anymore, could you? For a while, you could see the breath in the bubble, because that was what was going into it. So the word vanity, or the word meaningless, means vapour, breath. Something that is ephemeral, fleeting, very short-lived. One commentator said it's the nearest thing to zero. The nearest thing to zero. I like that description of it. Why does Solomon say this? Because as he looks out on the world, he asks the question in question 3 here. What does man gain from all his labour which he toils under the sun? What is the benefit of it all, he says? And he can't see any benefits at the end of the day. In Genesis 2, when God made creation, he made it good, he put the man to work in the garden. It wasn't toil, it was delightful work, caring for the garden that God had created. But look what it becomes here. What does man gain for all his labour? Not work, but his labour, at which he toils under the sun. You see how work has gone from something being very good, something positive, and now it carries a sense of toil. Something which is hard. Indeed, in Genesis 3, in the curse, God said to Adam, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground from which you were taken, for dust you were, and to dust you shall return." In the parable that Jesus tells of the workers in the vineyard, do you remember the workers complain at the end of the day? They get 1 talent, the same as the other workers who had just come at the last minute, worked only for a few minutes or an hour or so in the garden. And they complain, "We who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day," they say to Jesus, "we deserve more than this. And all you're giving us is this talent, the same as those latecomers, as Johnny-come-latelys, who don't deserve half of it because of the fact that they haven't worked half as hard as we have in your garden." Work has become toilsome, hard, sweat-filled, oppressive. So, Ecclesiastes, the teacher, says, that's what I think. Life is meaningless. I can't see any point to it all. It goes round and round. And he repeats that when he speaks about the cycle of nature, from verses 4 to the first part of verse 8. Generations come and go, he says, but the earth remains forever. Compared to us, nature seems permanent, doesn't it? If you've ever been for a holiday, maybe to the Alps or to Scotland or the Lake District, you've walked among those mountains, maybe even gone to Dartmoor and seen the tors there, you've gone to Hay Tor perhaps, and you put your hand on that solid granite there. This has been here for thousands of years. It will be long after I've gone as well. It just stays there the whole time, doesn't it? Weathered a little fraction every year, getting smaller and smaller, but actually compared to us, it seems permanent, doesn't it? Those rocks, those mountains have seen countless generations come and go. But to what purpose is Ecclesiastes? The sun rises and the sun sets repeatedly. It's an interesting word that's used there. It talks about the sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back. The word hurries means pants or gasps. It's like the sun itself is running a race. Got to get round and back again to the start and run again the race, the course of the day. And then run round again to get back to the beginning of the dawn. But what is the point, he says? The sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. And there's the wind, he says. It blows randomly, north, south, east and west. But what does it achieve? And then there's the water cycle, isn't it? Of the rain. It rains down, and we saw some rain, haven't we, recently, this last month of March. And I think, was it February as well? I can't remember. I think February was a drought month, wasn't it? But we saw some rain in March. And the rain falls, and the streams fill up, and they go into the rivers, and the rivers go into the seas go into the oceans. And we know that the oceans evaporates from there back into the clouds, back into the streams. The whole cycle goes on and on. It's wearisome, he says. The sun rises and sun sets. Wind blows to the south, turns to the north, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea. The sea is never full. All things, verse 8, all things are wearisome, he says. I've seen it all, and it's so boring. More than one can say. What Ecclesiastes here, what Solomon is reflecting, is what Paul says in Romans 8. The creation which we sang about at the beginning, which was so beautiful at the beginning, like those bubbles, so full of colour and of light. They move so serenely, so beautifully spherical. But actually they're burst. Creation is groaning, says Paul. It is subject to frustration, to vanity. The world we live in is like that, says Paul. And then we have the cycle of human history, from the second part of verse 8 to verse 11. And Ecclesiastes sees a similar pattern here in human behaviour, as we saw in nature. He ends that previous section by saying the sea is never full. The streams keep flowing into it, but it never gets filled up. And as the sea is never filled, so also our appetite, he says, are never satisfied. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. Have you seen the latest Banksy mural? Have you been to watch the latest blockbuster movie? Have you heard the latest Taylor Swift album? Maybe that's not quite your generation. But you've got the latest iPhone? Maybe it doesn't apply to you either. What about the latest home improvement? Or the latest car that a certain manufacturer has brought out? Have you seen it? Have you driven it on a test drive yet? Do you long for it? Do you want it? The latest gadget in your home maybe? Or fashion accessory? There's no end to us being lusting after these things, wanting to be satisfied and yet not satisfied. Verses 9 and 10, what has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new? No, it was here already, long ago. It was here before our time. Edward Gibbon wrote that mammoth work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in the 18th century. He said this: history is little more than the register of the crimes, follies and misfortunes of mankind. Karl Marx, the fellow who founded communism, who worked it out and wrote the Communist Manifesto, he says history repeats itself, first as tragedy and then as farce. What a cynical view. Goes around in a cyclical fashion, repeating itself, but first time it's tragedy, but after that it becomes farcical. We've seen it all before. Now it's interesting that Marx should say that, because Marx lived in the 19th century, a century of great progress, a century of ideals. Communism was actually proposed by him to end history, to bring an end to this cycle of tragedy and then farce, and to bring about the class of society, or so he hoped. But not only Karl Marx, but many people in the 19th century believed in progress. They thought that the earth or the human civilization was improving. This included Christians who had a view of the millennium as well. They thought they were working their way up to the millennium. It's called post-millennialism, and it believes that actually human beings can actually reach a certain point when we make the earth fit for God to return. Because we improve people so much, we improve civilization so much. We Christianize the world, was the hope of many in the 19th century. It all came to a shattering end in 1914 when the First World War broke out, and millions, tens of millions, died in that slaughterhouse over those 4.5 years. In 1931, after that war ended, Aldous Huxley wrote one of the most deeply pessimistic novels ever written, Brave New World. If you haven't read it, well, if you've got stomach for it, do read it, and it will show you how deeply cynical he had become. Many like him as well. Our century, and indeed the 20th century before us as well, which most of us have lived in, I guess, have been the centuries when idealism has died. It's been dashed to pieces. what has happened in the last 150 years or so. We ourselves know there is nothing new under the sun. Dictators come, dictators go. Propaganda is put out by one side and then the other. We know the cycle. Politicians come, they get into power, they become corrupt. We vote them out of power if we're lucky enough to have the votes. And we know that the whole lot are going to come in. As someone once said, it doesn't matter who you vote for, the government will always get in. Verse 11. Verse 11, this writer concludes, there is no remembrance of men of old, and even those who are yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow. Like those bubbles, we pass into dust, and we will be forgotten, won't we? I remember my nan very well. I love my nan very much, but she died in 1975. My children never met her. They know the name, perhaps, but they don't know her at all. Some people go to work creating family trees and go back as far as they can, and maybe they will recover some of the names in their genealogies going back, but eventually they'll come to a point when even that will trail into emptiness and they'll be lost in the mists of time. That is the world that Ecclesiastes presents to us. If the book ended at verse 11, I think we'd find it all quite depressing and quite grim, wouldn't we? Life is seen as an end, or life, if it's seen as an end in itself, is pointless. It is meaningless. But you notice, in those 11 verses, not once does he mention the word God. Not once does God's name appear there. Here is the God who has given Solomon his wisdom and all his great wealth and power. But not once does his name appear here. Isn't that curious? I think at this stage, what Ecclesiastes, Solomon is trying to get through to us is that he wants us to see how barren, how empty life is under the sun. If there is no God. This is the secular view of life. If that is all there is, that is how grim it really is, how pointless it all really is. It's what our secular world, by the way, presents to us. If you've watched a Brian Cox documentary or a David Attenborough documentary, incredible films, aren't they, about the universe and about the planets, or about wildlife and the seas and what takes place in the polar caps and so on. And yet actually, when you think about it, what's the benefit from all that? Indeed, if you listen to David Attenborough, he's worried the whole thing is going to be turned to zero by climate change. It's all threatened, it all comes to nothing. But even if that didn't happen, what is it but an accumulation of knowledge? Where does it all lead? You watch it, you think how lovely, the program comes to an end, and so what? One day you'll die, and one day that creation may die as well. If secularists' view is correct, it doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't achieve anything. We should find it deeply unsatisfying, says Ecclesiastes. And indeed, many people in our society who are not Christians, not believers, do find it deeply dissatisfying. I think that's why you have this today, this huge mental health crisis. People are deeply depressed because life they see is going nowhere. Perhaps their lives are going nowhere as well. People are wearing t-shirts. Is this it on it? With a big question mark, because it seems to them that actually, if this is it, there's not much to it after all. They're beginning to understand what Ecclesiastes is trying to tell us now, all those thousands of years ago. Does this resonate at all with you? Is there an echo in your mind of these things? Do you recognise this view of life? It may not be your own life, but you recognise it as the world under the sun? Life under the sun? Yes, if we're believers, we have something more than that, but actually, is it the life we live? Maybe before you became a Christian. Do you recognise it as the life you used to live? Do you cry out for meaning and for purpose and permanence? A bit like those rocks on Dartmoor. Something that's solid, that won't go away. Like those bubbles that won't just burst and leave nothing at the end. As our world grows increasingly secular, particularly our society here in the West, it is walking down that, or even running down that broad path to destruction that Jesus spoke about. Can I ask you a question? Are you ready to engage with it under the sun? Do you have anything to offer that's better than what they have already. This world that Ecclesiastes has mapped out for us in these first 11 verses. Can you see it for what it is? And relate to people who are living under that sort of understanding. Can you offer a God who gives meaning and permanence? Solomon, in all his wisdom, couldn't penetrate the mystery. He ends up at this point, well, he goes a bit further, as we'll see actually in the book of Ecclesiastes, but there was something beyond there. He reached out for it, he couldn't find it. He asked many important questions over the chapters that follow that we'll be looking at in the weeks to come. But 1,000 years later, another son of David, also a teacher, would appear with answers. And when the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, those cynics, came up to him and asked him for a sign to prove who he was, he said this: the Queen of the South, that's the Queen of Sheba we looked at earlier, will rise at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom. And now, one greater than Solomon is here. Now one greater than Solomon is here, Jesus says to them. I showed you that picture earlier, didn't I, of that man looking over Cape Town. Do you remember that one? And that incredible vantage point, looking over the part of the kingdom, as it was at one time, of South Africa, the Zulu tribes and the like. A great vast expanse of ocean as well. What a view that is, what a vantage point that man had. Solomon's view was similar, wasn't it? He saw all this world beneath him, all the power that he had. But in Matthew 4, the devil took Jesus up to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendour. All this, he says, I will give you if you will bow down and worship me. All that Solomon had, Jesus would have even more. All the splendour, all the gold, all the goods, all the trade, all the wealth, all that, Satan says, can be yours. Just bow down and worship me. Leave God out of it and worship. And I will give you this. You can have it. And Jesus, who is one greater than Solomon, must have for a split second seen all that Solomon saw and more. And then turned away and said to Satan, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. That's where Jesus, son of David, differs from Solomon, the son of David. Solomon had all those riches and turned away, led astray, we were told, weren't we, earlier. Jesus turned around and said to Satan, no. Away from me, for it is written, worship the Lord your God. Put him at the centre and serve him only. Jesus is the son of David, the teacher, who is qualified to speak about life not only under the sun, but also life above the sun. When he rose on Resurrection Sunday, he rose into heaven itself and entered into the very presence of God. And he tells us that we can be there with him, that we too can enjoy that life, not only under the sun, but also what lies beyond, to an awareness that there is in heaven a place that is permanent and will not be taken away from us.